Sometimes hauntings are as mild as a home where the lights flicker just a little bit, or items seem to go missing, just for them to show up later, after you've spent the whole day searching. Sometimes they get more dangerous, where things fly across the room, or disembodied voices keep you up all night, or someone ends up possessed. Sounds like a horror movie, right? Or maybe an episode of Supernatural? The interesting thing about today's topic is that there are so many accounts ranging from 1820 or so, all the way up to nearing the close of the 1900s, somewhere in the 1970 to 1980 date range. There are books, letters, articles, movies, and more. I don't want to try to debunk today's topic because if we were to dig into every little detail recorded over the course of more than 2 centuries at this point and try to link everything together, it would take a ridiculously long time. Why is that? Is it just a story that's kept growing and growing over time? Did it start out as an elaborate prank? Or is it something otherworldly? Hey, I'm April, and we are on a witchful journey. Before I really begin today, I want to give a huge thanks to my significant other for being so supportive in whatever I do. He got some better equipment for me recently, and I've had a chance to get a few episodes produced since then, and it has made all the difference. So, thank you, Nate. I also want to give thanks to whoever the 2 new folks are that graced me with 5-star ratings on Spotify. I'm not able to see who leaves those ratings or hits the follow button, but I appreciate all of you. I'm also very thankful for the slowly growing number of you wonderful people who have liked, followed, commented, and or shared any of the previous episodes. You all rock. So let's get down to it and start off with our usual tarot card. Today's card is the 4 of Coins from the Tarot of the Shadow Realm deck. This card appears to us to remind us all that we may be too attached to material possessions. We place too much of our security into the things we possess, as if owning more somehow means that we're safer. I hate to be the one to break it to you, but filling that hole in your soul with material goods isn't going to work out in the long run. It's not sustainable. And this actually ties in pretty well with a daily affirmation I shared on my socials yesterday. I am valued. We have to break the cycle of self-hate and self-depreciation and learn to love ourselves again. Learn to place value in ourselves again. And that's what's going to help us all feel less of a need for material possessions. Your value doesn't exist in external sources, like the kind of car you drive, the job title you hold, the size of your house, or whether or not you have the newest iPhone. Some of those things offer a type of security, but those fade. Their value diminishes at some point. Realizing that it comes from within and that everything else is just the glitter, that's sustainable. That feels more magical than anything you could purchase. Okay, so the reason I wanted to share the story of the Bell Witch haunting with you today is because I find it interesting that it falls under the label of witch. More often than not, when this particular case or story is brought up, it's referred to as the legend of the Bell Witch, or simply the Bell Witch. The reason I'm including the word haunting here is because there doesn't appear to be an actual physical person that brings about the things that happen in this story. I'm going to call it a story today because, like I said previously, I'm not here to debunk anything. I'm not here to prove anything. I'm not here to tell you what you should think or believe. I'm presenting this story to you as an opportunity for you to decide for yourself. The events of this story begin in what is now Adams, Tennessee, in 1817. We should go further back, though, as some of the tale does have something to do with things that took place before then. So we'll rewind to the late 1700s in Edgecombe, North Carolina, where a man named John Bell has learned the trade of barrel making and joined the Union Baptist Church. He was good at what he did and ended up purchasing a 323-acre farm on the south side of Cahokie Swamp. In 1782, he married a young girl named Lucy Williams, who was only 12 at the time, according to most sources about her, though there is some evidence to suggest that she was older, possibly 17. He was 32, but that was the late 1700s, and that bit of information is only important for our purposes later on. Anyway, John moved Lucy onto the farm with him, and together they worked hard to make a life for themselves. And they did pretty well. The farm grew in size over time, sporting corn, cotton, and tobacco, and became one of the best plantations in the area. John's family also grew to include children Jesse, Mary, John Jr., Drury, Benjamin, Esther, and Zadok. The plantation grew to the point where John decided to hire an overseer so he could spend less time in the fields managing the slaves, crops, and livestock, and more time with his family and managing their finances. The overseer was a young man named Mr. Black, who was very knowledgeable about the job he was hired for. The sources that mention this new young overseer claim that he wasn't a pleasant person to be around, though. He didn't get along with anyone in the community, and he was often cruel to the slaves, beyond what was considered normal for the location and time period. Side note, I'm not condoning slavery. I'm not saying it was right to own slaves or that it was right to beat them. However, it is part of our history in the U.S., and most slave owners didn't treat their slaves well. So when I say Mr. Black went beyond what was normal for the location and time period, I mean that he was absolutely brutal with his beatings. The overseer would often argue with, threaten, and be generally disrespectful towards John Bell, and after particularly heated arguments, the overseer would return to the slaves and beat them so severely that they could hardly work productively. All of this combined, and it reached a point where John and Lucy discussed the possibility of firing their overseer. His actions were affecting their profits and hurting their reputation. The final straw, though, came on one particular day. It was well known that the overseer had a fondness for John and Lucy's daughter, Mary, which was all fine and dandy. Well, maybe not. I can't imagine that John would be too pleased about such an unpleasant man being interested in his daughter. Either way, John sought out Mr. Black to speak to him about a previous argument. He could hear Mr. Black in one of their barns speaking to the slaves, and as he approached, Mr. Black's words became clearer, speaking of John's daughter Mary in a way that was, we'll say, incredibly distasteful. Infuriated, John left without a word to calm himself and determine how to proceed with this monstrosity of a man. Ultimately, John returned to the barn as the slaves were leaving for the day and requested that Mr. Black hang back for a moment to discuss some business. With the two men alone in the barn, John shot Mr. Black. John, of course, had to face legal charges, but was found not guilty for reasons of self-defense. At this point, some sources say that John was excommunicated from the Union Baptist Church, and that's why the Bell family moved from North Carolina a couple years later. A couple of sources say that John was commissioned by the church to move out to Tennessee to become one of the elders in a branch of the church out there. And other sources claim that John remained with the church, but within 2 years of Mr. Black's demise, the crops on the Bell plantation failed, and they lost a number of livestock to disease. Because of this, they suffered a loss of profits and had to sell the plantation and a number of their slaves. We could say that it was a drought, or that some natural disaster hit that caused the failing crops, but it appears as though there wasn't anything recorded for the surrounding area to back either story. The crops and livestock on the surrounding farms and plantations were doing just fine in that same time period. This would have been about 1802 to 1803. Some speculate that Mr. Black haunted the Bell plantation. And some speculate that because some of John's friends had already moved out to Adams, Tennessee, and had been sending letters back, speaking of how beautiful, lush, and perfect the area was for crops and raising children, he and Lucy decided to make a go of it. Their current plantation wasn't producing anymore, so why not? So the true reasons remain unclear. Regardless of the why, though, John and Lucy Bell sold their plantation in North Carolina, packed up their belongings, their children, and remaining slaves, and made the long journey during the winter of 1803 to 1804. When they arrived in Adams, Tennessee, John purchased a 200-acre plot of land bordering the south side of the Red River. There was already a house and a few other buildings that were built on the land that were large enough for his family and the slaves that they'd brought with them. Not long after arriving, the Bells became members of the Red River Baptist Church. For the Bells, Tennessee, it seems, began like a dream come true. They were surrounded by friends, they were well-liked, their home became a site for numerous social gatherings and Bible studies, they had their faith, and their new farm prospered and grew. And their family grew to include 3 more children: Elizabeth, who was often called Betsy, Richard, and Joel. That dream would only last about 13 years, though. When Betsy was just 12 years old, she caught the attention of a young man named Joshua Gardner, who was 6 years her senior. Knowing that she was too young to court at the time, Joshua settled with simply spending time with her and the Bell family. It seems that the Bells and the Gardners got on well with each other, so neither John nor Lucy had a problem with Joshua's interest in Betsy. In the fall of 1817, though, strange, unexplainable things began to happen on the Bell property. One day, while walking among the corn rows in one of his fields, John Bell came across an odd creature. It had the body of a dog, but its head resembled something like a rabbit, and it had green eyes. John and this creature stared at each other, unmoving, for several minutes before John raised his gun to shoot the creature. It runs off, and despite John's attempt to follow it, he was unable to find tracks. It was as if the creature disappeared into thin air, and he never saw it again. About a week later, the Bell family was sitting around the table eating dinner when Drury and Betsy mentioned seeing an old woman making her way through the corn rows in one of the fields, and then she just disappeared. John told them it was probably someone new to the area, and they probably hadn't realized they'd been trespassing. The following night, Drury hurriedly tells John that he just saw the largest bird he's ever seen sitting on the fence out by the road, and that it flew off before he could take a shot at it. This triggers Phyllis, one of the house slaves that would generally serve their dinner, to mention that another of the Bell slaves, Dean, had spoken about a large black dog that had recently begun following him down the road at night. You see, Dean was married to a slave on the Gunn farm. The Gunn family were also very good friends of the Bells, and Dean was allowed to walk over to the other farm to visit his wife each night. It was on these nightly walks out to the Gunn farm that this large black dog would jump out of the same spot of the bushes at Dean and proceed to follow him down the road until he reached the edge of the Bell Gunn property, at which point it would turn around and run back the way that they'd come. I've read that Dean's wife, upon finding out that he was being followed every night, made a witch ball to protect Dean at night when he would make his way back and forth between their living quarters. We'll talk a little bit about witch balls later and go more in depth at another time. But it seems that Dean's wife was wise to make him carry one, and it's said that on many of Dean's encounters with this dog, it would tell him to throw the ball away. Several weeks passed without incident for the Bells, and then one night as the Bell family was preparing for bed, there came a knock on the door. And then it continued on the outer walls of the home. Several times, John Sr. and John Jr. would try to quickly open the door and run outside, believing at first that it was a prank. Over the course of a few days, the knocking grew louder and more frequent. As the nights passed, the children became fearful of going outside after dark, and even John Sr. would strike up conversation just before going outside, so that whoever he was speaking with would follow him out. Because men in those days weren't allowed to express feelings like fear, because then they were seen as weak. Oh, wait. Over 200 years later, and not much has changed in that regard. Let's do better, society. I'm feeling like 200 years should be more than enough time for us to move away from that kind of shit, you know what I mean? Come on. Anyway, as winter began to set in and nights began to get colder, the knocking and thumping noises began happening inside the house. New sounds joined in as well. The sound of gnawing could be heard on many nights in the children's bedrooms, as if a rat was chewing on their bedpost. And each time the children would light their candle to find the rat, the sounds would stop and there would be no noticeable markings that they could find anywhere. As soon as the candle was blown out, the sounds would begin again. The sound of chains being dragged along the floor could often be heard downstairs in the middle of the night and would carry on that way until about 3 or 4 in the morning. Not long after these new sounds began to happen, the children began experiencing physical disturbances. Unseen hands would tug at their pillows and blankets at night, and if a child chose to resist the tugging, it resulted in the blankets being pulled off completely or by an invisible slap to the face. The children were often left freezing and terrified after these encounters. But none of them received as much abuse from this unseen force as 12-year-old Betsy. One night, John Sr. and Lucy rushed to Betsy's bedside after hearing an ear-piercing scream come from her room. They found her lying in bed, crying, with her hair tied in knots around her bedpost, covered in hand-shaped red welts, and multiple fresh bruises began to appear on her body. Later that same night, she let out a second scream that had everyone rushing to her bedside. This time, they found her sitting in bed, covering her ears with blood-soaked hands. The following morning, she was still covered in bruises and could barely hear when spoken to. John Sr. decided that it was time to see if this thing that was tormenting them possessed any kind of intelligence by asking it questions that would require a number for an answer. Each question he asked, the response was given in the form of knocks, and always the correct number. So John swore his family and his slaves to secrecy. No one was to breathe a word of the spirit, as John began to call it, to anyone outside of their homestead. The fear was that they would be met with skepticism and would suffer a loss of credibility within their community. In the spring of 1818, Betsy, Richard, and Joel go for a walk in the woods, with the intention of going to the river at the edge of the property. They came upon a large sinkhole and saw something greenish in the trees nearby. As they got closer, they realized it was the body of a woman in a green dress, and she'd been hung from the tree, and she appeared to be dead. Side note, there are some discrepancies to this story, as some sources say the woman was hanging from the branch by her hands, swinging, and was alive. The children brought this up to their parents at the dinner table that night, to which Drew, because that's what I'm going to call him from now on, replies that while he and a few farmhands were walking back from the fields earlier that day, dirt was being flung at them, and they couldn't determine where it was originating from. This wasn't the first time it had happened, he'd said, and it turns out it wouldn't be the last. About the same time that the sounds began moving into the house, John Sr. began experiencing something similar to paralysis of the mouth. It's said that there were often times that he would turn down an offer of dining at a friend's house and would later have to explain the onset of his mysterious illness. He sought the help of the local doctor many times, and nothing that Dr. George Hobson gave him seemed to help in any way. John Sr. explained the experiences as if someone had inserted a stick sideways in his mouth, which prevented him from having full control of his tongue and chewing abilities. Some days were worse than others. It wasn't long before things evolved further in the household, and the sound of faint whistling and whispers could be heard throughout the home both day and night. Sometimes the sound of a woman's faint cry could also be heard. One night, the older Bell family members were sitting down after dinner to discuss the building of their flatboats for the upcoming travels to Port Royal, when Lucy Bell stopped them mid-conversation to bring attention to the lights in the dell outside. A dell is a spot in a field that is lower than the surrounding area, where there are often clumps of trees and bushes. The lights were described as candle-like, and the family originally thought that the lights came from the slaves who were having fun after a long, productive day in the fields. Before John Sr. could investigate the area, the lights went out. The slaves were asked about these lights the following day, but John Sr. was told that they hadn't come from anyone in the slaves' quarters. Shortly following the mysterious lights in the dell, unintelligible whispers could be heard in the household, and they seemed to be frustrated. Accompanying those frustrated whispers was furniture being thrown around the home. At one point, John Sr.'s chair was ripped out from under him, causing him to fall. John Jr. had had enough of all of that, so he decided to speak up and tell the spirit to focus its attention and energy on him rather than on his father or his sister Betsy. It seems that John Jr.'s demand triggered a response from the entity because later that night, Betsy had gone up to her room to go to bed and found that her entire bed was fully engulfed in flames. The moment a scream escaped Betsy's lips, the flame went out. Of course, everyone in the house ran to see what was happening, and John Jr., again, taunts the entity and demands that it leaves his father and his sister alone. I'm sure a chill went through everyone's spine when a disembodied but frail voice spoke back to him and said that John Jr. was too strong of an individual, and it was much more satisfying for the entity to inflict pain and suffering upon his father and sister, because that was how best to inflict pain on John Jr. From what I've read, it seems as though once the entity found its voice, the situation at the Bell home escalated. The disembodied voice grew in strength, and in a short time, it was having full conversations with people in the house. It would often insult and threaten John Sr. and argue with John Jr. When something upset the entity and it became dysregulated, it would create a high-pitched ringing sound that would cause bleeding from the ears. John Sr.'s ability to swallow and control any muscles involving his mouth just kept getting worse, and sometimes he would end up choking on his food or his drinks. And of course, since he wasn't able to eat a lot of the time, he began to lose weight and become quite gaunt. Dr. Hobson continued to be unable to medically treat whatever it was that John Sr. was experiencing. By the time a full year had passed since John Sr. saw the strange dog-like creature in the field, which puts us at about the fall of 1818, Lucy Bell had begun to suffer frequent minor illnesses due to the large amount of stress that the home situation put on her on a daily basis. And Betsy Bell began staying indoors and away from friends more often due to the constant barrage of torment that the entity inflicted upon her. She was almost always covered in bruises and welts, and often suffered severe exhaustion and spells of unconsciousness. She even began seeing Joshua Gardner less often, so that he wouldn't ask questions that the Bell family weren't ready to answer. Finally, John Sr. had reached a point where he felt like he needed to find someone who could help his family. He approached his longtime friend, James Johnston. James was someone who knew the Bell family long before they ever moved to Tennessee, so he was someone that John Sr. felt comfortable confiding in. John Sr. told James all about the troubles that the Bell family had been going through over the previous year, and asked if James would be willing to stay the night at the Bell home to see for himself. James Johnston, seeing that his dear friend was very troubled, decides that both he and his wife would stay overnight with the Bells to see if they would experience what John Sr. had described. The night comes where James and his wife arrive at the Bell home, and at first everything is quiet. Later that night, though, they begin to experience the knocking and the whispers, and James asks the entity who it was and why it was there. The entity responds by telling James that it is a spirit who was once happy but has been made unhappy. The following morning, James tells John Sr. that it's a spirit or a demon, like in the Bible, he says, and he suggests bringing in others in the community who would be able to aid the family further and who could potentially help rid the family of their problem. At first, John Sr. is opposed to the idea, but eventually gives in and seeks the help of a couple of the reverends in the community, both very good friends of his family. Reverend James Gunn posed the same question that James Johnston had posed, asking the entity who it was and what it wanted. The answer at that time was, "I am nothing but old Cape Bat's witch, here to torment old Jack Bell to his death." Jack is the name that the entity would typically use when speaking of John Bell. And this is where the entity got its name, Kate, which it would respond to and began to prefer being referred to by that name. But it claimed it was not Kate herself, but Kate's witch, suggesting that Kate Batts had somehow gotten the entity to do her bidding. Kate Batts was a neighbor of the Bells, and she was alive during the time that all of this was happening, so it wasn't her spirit. And when she heard that it claimed she sent it, she got quite upset, denying any link to the entity. Some sources say that Kate and John had had an affair and she felt slighted when he wouldn't leave Lucy, so she conjured up this entity. Other sources say that the Bells bought their land from Kate, and after some further dealings went sour, she felt as if Belle had abused her generosity. And a couple of sources say that Kate was the witch and was using her powers to torment the Bell family for fun. There's nothing concrete to suggest any of those theories are true, though. It wasn't long before word had spread around the community that the Bells were going through some strange happenings in their home. Most people in the community were supportive, curious, and concerned for the family. They began stopping by and attempting to engage with the entity. And it's hard to keep track of the order in which certain encounters happened, but I can tell you that a man named Frank Miles, who was a large and intimidating man, was one friend of the Bell family that would often spend his time in the home conversing with the entity in order to distract it from tormenting the Bells, allowing them to get some actual rest every now and then. The problem with that was that Frank had a temper on him and would sometimes enrage the entity or the spirit enough to trigger a worse experience for Betsy. For example, one story is that he told Betsy to sit by him and he would protect her from the entity, to which the entity responded by telling him that he was no match for it, despite his size. Betsy suffered worse treatment by the entity later that night. There are many stories of various people's encounters with the entity, and I don't want to bore you by telling you all of them, but I do want to share enough of them so you have an idea of what kinds of things were happening. So, Calvin Johnston, one of James Johnston's sons, visited the Bells and, while there, asked the entity to shake his hand to prove itself. And I thought this one was interesting because at first, the entity refused, showing concern that Calvin may try to capture it once he had a hold of it. Calvin had to promise that he had no such intentions before the entity finally agreed and shook his hand. And it seems that only one other person was actually able to touch the entity. A man named William Porter. He had gone to visit the Bells with the intention to encounter the entity himself. He spoke with the entity, and in the conversation, the entity mentioned something about keeping William warm at night. He made a joke that if the entity were going to spend a night in his bed, it would have to behave itself. Later that night, William Porter got into bed and discovered that his blankets began to move near his feet, as if someone was crawling up the bed underneath them, and that just gave me a shiver. He saw this as his chance to get rid of the entity. So he grabbed at it, wrapping the blankets around it, and tried to carry it to the fireplace to burn it. He was unsuccessful, claiming that it suddenly became heavier the closer he got to the fireplace, and a putrid, rotting stench came from it that was strong enough to make him drop the blanketed entity and run from the room. John Johnston, another of James Johnston's sons, tested the entity at one point, asking it what his Dutch step-grandmother in North Carolina would say to the slaves when they did something wrong. The entity responded with, "Hut tut, what has happened now?" in the voice and accent of his step-grandmother. Later on, he was threatened by the entity, and while walking home the next day, he said he could have sworn that there was a knife floating in the air behind his head. He could see it out of the corner of his eye. When he turned, nothing was there, and he attributed it to a shadow of one of the cornstalk blades. There was no shortage of people wanting to run their tests. As word of the phenomena spread even further, an Englishman showed up on the Bell doorstep one day to try to determine the truth behind the entity. He arrived skeptical, but upon hearing the entity mimic his parents' voice, both parents were in England at the time, he was convinced it was some kind of spirit or demon. He later wrote to the Bell family, apologizing for doubting them, explaining that after he left, he reached out to his parents to see if they truly had been visited by a spirit that spoke using his voice, and they confirmed that they had. The story is interesting because it suggests that the entity is not confined to a specific area and can travel very long distances in a short amount of time. People began arriving from faraway places to stay with the Bell family, some of them offering money or other goods in exchange for the hospitality, and it's said that John Sr. always turned down any kind of payment. So the theory that it was all a con to get people's money doesn't seem to hold up. Some people thought that maybe Betsy had learned ventriloquism, or the mystical arts, from her brothers John Jr. and Drew, because they had served in the military under Andrew Jackson and had spent some time in New Orleans. There are a couple of theories on that. One is that she was doing it to force marriage between her and Joshua Gardner. Another was that she was trying to scare him off. And yet another was that she suffered from mental illness and that the entity was somehow that illness presenting itself. A Dr. Fort from Missouri even tried to prove that Betsy was behind the whole thing. He failed, in case you were wondering. Different people were treated in different ways by the entity. Some would be chased off at the edge of the property by a large black dog that the Bells didn't even own. Some would be welcomed into the home only to be immediately confronted by the entity, their secrets spoken out loud in front of everyone. And some, the entity would hold conversations with. It seemed to know everything about everyone. It was well versed in the scripture of the Bible and would debate with some people on it, almost as if it enjoyed debating. It also had a more mischievous side, claiming various origins, including the disturbance of a Native American burial ground. It went so far as to claim that it was in search of a tooth that had gone missing in the house, a tooth that had fallen from a jawbone when it was thrown against the wall by Drew, after it had been dug up from said burial ground. Oh, and the reason Drew had the jawbone in the first place? The entity had sent him and his friend Bennett Porter on a wild goose chase for buried treasure, previous to the entity's claim that it was looking for a tooth. The Bell family tore through the house looking for the lost tooth, only for the entity to tell them later that it was a joke. Secrets in other households in the area apparently weren't safe, as it was said that this entity would travel to someone's house to find out information in real time and share any gossip that was available. It apparently was also able to be in two places at once, and was reported to have proved this by parroting back two separate sermons given 13 miles apart from each other by two different reverends, and those sermons had originally been given at the exact same time. Despite the entity's hatred for John Sr., with its threats to kill him, and its obvious dislike for Betsy, having expressed displeasure when Betsy and Joshua got engaged, it apparently was capable of fondness for Lucy Bell. It was reported that it considered Lucy to be the most perfect woman to walk the earth, and it would shower her with hazelnuts and fresh fruits when she was ill, and sing her hymns in a voice that others said sounded absolutely angelic. My personal opinion is that it wasn't fond of Lucy. It just had to torment her in a different way, because tormenting her directly wouldn't have been as effective. I've read a few sources that say that Andrew Jackson himself made his way to the Bell home at one point with a small group of his men. There's nothing that can confirm that he was actually there, but the story goes that upon his arrival on the Bell property, his wagon got stuck. Not in the mud, not on a rock, not in a hole. But while it was stuck, he and his men heard a voice that they attributed to the entity, telling Jackson that it would see him later that night. And then the wagon was released, allowing them to carry on down the lane. That night, after hours of silence from the entity, one of Jackson's men was bragging about being a witch hunter, or a witch layer, saying that the entity was too scared to come out while he was present. And he was promptly beaten by an unseen force and tossed out the door by his nose. Jackson was quoted as saying he'd rather face the whole of the British Army as to face the Bell Witch again. Supposedly, that account is in a letter dated for sometime in 1894, long after the events would have taken place, and the letter is, as of now, unverified. During all of the visitations to the Bell home, from people wanting to experience the Bell Witch for themselves, John Sr.'s health continued to deteriorate until mid-December of 1820, when he didn't come out for breakfast one morning. That was unusual for John, despite his failing health. So John Jr., being his primary caretaker at the time, decided to go and check on him and found that he was unable to rouse his father. From here, there are different versions of what happened next. One version, which is stated in M.V. Ingram's book, Authenticated History of the Bell Witch, says that Richard Bell claimed John Sr. was already quite sick and had been bedridden for quite some time. John Jr. found that he couldn't rouse his father one morning and went to check the medicine cupboard and found a strange vial with only a small amount of dark liquid left in it. He called on Dr. Hobson, but John Sr. ended up passing away the following morning on December 20th. Another version is that upon finding that he couldn't rouse his father, John Jr. went to tend the fireplace to warm the room and found the vial, full of liquid, in the flue of the chimney. Called on Dr. Hobson, who said that they needed to test the liquid, and they gave 1 drop to a stray cat, and the cat died several seconds later. Some versions say it was several hours later. And it was determined that it was poison. The entity spoke up and claimed that it had placed the vial there for the purpose of killing John Sr. with it. When asked how it would accomplish this, the entity replied with, "By pouring it into the dinner pot, of course." John Sr. died just a couple of days later. Another version claims that John Sr. was already deceased by the time the vial was found. I would like to point out that he was 70 years old when he passed away, which, at that time, wasn't particularly common. At any rate, it seems that all accounts agree that John Sr. died of poisoning. His family all appeared to agree that it was by the entity's hand, and he seems to be the only person in history, known history, to have his death officially attributed to a spirit. It was reported that the entity decided to crash John's funeral and sing cheerful drinking songs, which, rude. The hauntings seemed to have subsided after John's passing, especially once Betsy called off her engagement to Joshua Gardner, out of fear that something similar would happen to them if they did get married. Before finally departing, the entity did say that it would return in 7 years' time. From some of what I've read, it seems that it did return to the Bell home in 1828 for a short time. But since the only ones remaining in the house were Lucy, Richard, and Joel, and they had no interest in interacting with the entity, it went away. I find it interesting that before anything was allowed to be officially published about the phenomena at the Bell home, an agreement had supposedly been made that all of the original affected family members had to have passed away first. So really, there are no actual first-hand accounts that we know of and are verifiable. The authenticated history of the Bell Witch wasn't published until 1894. Even the section titled Our Family Troubles, which was supposedly written by Richard Bell, wasn't made known until after his passing. And for that reason, many today see the book as a fraud, or at least a historical fiction. Though for a long time the book was considered the primary full-length record of what took place. Obviously something had to have happened, since so many of the people in this story were actual people with actual living descendants. Some of those descendants still live in or near Adams, Tennessee. A man named Bob Bell, who is descended from John Bell Sr. through Joel, has said that strange things always happened in their family every now and that when he was a child was when he first learned that his family was the one that was connected to the story. Something strange happened in his grandmother's house where all of her fine china had somehow come out of her hutch and ended up on the floor with a loud crash, but none of it was broken. Bob Bell says that he often hears strange noises in his own home, and it seems that in many places in Adams, strange things happen. Remember when I mentioned Dean earlier and the witch ball that his wife made for him to carry when he would walk between the Bell and Gunn properties? Though witch balls did exist in the early 1800s, they were made out of blown glass and are generally very colorful. Actually, 1840 was when they began being mass-produced in places like Germany and Austria, though they'd been around since the late 1500s or so, I think. You hang them in a window, usually an east-facing window, to protect your home from evil spirits because they're meant for drawing the evil spirits into them and trapping them. In my opinion, something like a witch ball may have been too fragile to take on nightly walks. And though I know New England did end up using them, I can't say for certain that Tennessee or even North Carolina would have had them. And that suggests, at least to me, that Dean's wife would have had to make one herself. I'm not saying that women can't be glass blowers, but given that they were slaves, what Dean's wife probably made for him was more likely a gree-gree bag. I know in my first episode, The Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, I promised we'd dig into that. Next time we hang out, I'll tell you everything I know about gree-gree bags and everything else voodoo. Thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out with me today. If you enjoyed this episode and don't want to miss out on future episodes, hit those like and follow buttons. It's super helpful in letting me know what topics you guys find interesting. For now, you can find me on Facebook, Witchful Journey Podcast, on Instagram at _Witchful_Journey. For those of you who need a reminder, the underscores are the spaces with the little lines at the bottom. On BlueSky at awitchfuljourney.bsky.social, and on YouTube, A Witchful Journey. I enjoy hearing from listeners, so if you pop in on my socials, say hi. You can also email me at awitchfuljourney@gmail.com. I'm April, and we are on a witchful journey.